Hello YouTube, Hive Radical. I came on with this because this is kind of the big news on the Prop 8 front today. This is a thing by Morris A. Thurston. Morris A. Thurston. He is a BYU Professor of Law, and he wrote a response to a paper titled 6 Consequences if Proposition 8 Fails. Now, just kind of a quick rundown here of why this is relevant. Well, of course, the faith I belong to, the Mormon Church, has put a great deal of resources and concentration, not the church itself, but it's encouraged its members to put a great deal of resources into promoting and trying to pass Proposition 8. And so there's this 6 consequences the coalition has identified if Proposition 8 fails, as this paper that I guess has been floating around Proposition 8 coalition. And what happens here is that Morris A. Thurston, a Mormon BYU Professor of Law, goes through and takes it apart, basically, and takes it apart to the point where the No on Prop 8 website has posted a link to the PDF on this. And now Morris A. Thurston's stated goal is that he doesn't believe, that he says most of the arguments contained in 6 consequences are either untrue or misleading. And he says intent is to be of service in helping our church avoid charges of using falsehoods to gain a political victory. Relying on deceptive arguments is not only contrary to gospel principles, but ultimately works against the very mission of the church. And he's completely correct in stating that. Now, in saying that, these points, these 6 points, and many of them have ties to things that are stated in Yes on Prop 8 commercials. Now, I think it's important, though, to not inherently connect this document and its failures to the overall gist and the underlying issues of both the other commercials, and then also just of the overall concerns with regard to not having Prop 8 pass and having the definition of marriage being permanently altered as it is presently accepted under the California Constitution since the ruling by the Supreme Court, by the 4 justices in the California Supreme Court. So, now to get into this, I'm going to go through, at least on this first point, and address what Thurston points out as being the technical errors. Now, I'll say that both from what I saw, just reading some of these points, I just had to read the points that they had. I didn't necessarily have to see Thurston's explanation to see the technical errors in what they were saying. And then some of them he does properly show the error, especially the technical errors in them. That being said, there are things that are askew, I believe, in Mr. Thurston's presentation that I hope to also point out. And they're askew not in that I've found any errors in what Mr. Thurston says, but rather I've found errors in how it addresses and how it applies to the actual underlying issues and the actual underlying concerns and the actual underlying reasons for passing Proposition 8. So, now that I've been excessively wordy, let's get down to this. The first point from the document, and again, this is the document that Thurston is analyzing. He quotes the whole thing in here and then puts his comments afterwards. The first one says, children in public schools will have to be taught that same-sex marriage is just as good as traditional marriage. We jump down through that and come to his comments. He says, this is untrue. And then he goes through California Education Code and takes out specific things and tries to take this apart. Now, the interesting thing about this attempt to take this apart, and again, he's accurate in all that he says here as far as respecting the law, respecting what he says about the law. And at the end, I don't believe he's correct on this first point in saying that it's not true, and I'll point out why here. But he says it provides that, and this is referring to California Education Code law, it provides that instruction shall be age appropriate and medically accurate, shall teach, quote, respect for marriage and committed relationships, unquote. So that quoted part, the respect for marriage and committed relationships, that's actually being drawn from the actual education code in California. He goes on to say after this, he says, therefore, no provision of the education code requires any teacher to teach that same-sex marriage is just as good as traditional marriage. And he's completely right in that, because there is no provision of the education code that requires any teacher to teach that same-sex marriage is just as good as traditional marriage. The key caveat, and the thing I think he's even potentially being dishonest on here, which would be, in my view, uber hypocritical, if you're trying to, claim that you're trying to keep church from having the label of lying or misleading being applied to it, and then if you yourself are misleading, there would be issues there. But I'm just going to go on and explain this. He says, again, I'll repeat this, therefore, no provision of the education code requires any teacher to teach that same-sex marriage is, quote, just as good, unquote, as traditional marriage. He's correct on this, but the thing that's not pointed out is, again, that quote. It says, shall teach, quote, respect for marriage and committed relationships. Now, what happens when you change the definition of marriage? When you change the definition of marriage to include what was previously considered the other committed relationships, and those things end up falling under the label marriage. Well, what happens inherently, and is kind of a de facto and implicit outgrowth of that redefinition legally of the word marriage, is that when the teachers teach respect for marriage, which they are to do, it says shall teach, quote, respect for marriage, then marriage is no longer separate. Now, see, when it was separate, you could teach respect for marriage and respect for committed relationships without equating them. But when they both have the same term and they're considered the same under the legal law, and you have to teach respect for marriage and what law considers marriage, then isn't the natural outgrowth of that you're teaching that they're equivalent? And if you're teaching they're equivalent, isn't that saying they're just as good? So this is where I think he's in error on this point, because if they are to teach respect for marriage, and again that's a direct quote from that, and marriage entails these things, then I hope you see what I'm getting at. But see, and that's the whole thing, is he says there is therefore no provision of the education code requires any teacher to teach that same-sex marriage is just as good as traditional marriage. Well, the fact is, it doesn't have to. It just doesn't have to, because it's implicit in the redefining. When you redefine the legal term, then the whole legal body that employs that term itself is inherently altered. And see, that's the thing, is he can say this, and he can be completely right, and it's completely, it is, there are certain aspects here that are not correct technically in the way it's laid out here, but he can be technically accurate, but he can be missing the whole point, the whole concern. And just because the concern wasn't laid out prettily in a pleasing and a technically accurate manner in this point here in this document that he's critiquing, doesn't mean that the point doesn't still stand, especially the way he's laid it out. And the way he's laid it out, in my view, is rather misleading, because he's setting this up, he's trying to point out error on one side, while he's presenting this other thing without stating the full implications of it. Moving on to the rest of this, Now, the rest of these points, he goes, church may be sued over the tax-exempt status is the second point. I haven't really seen anybody address it, because at least nobody on the no on Prop 8 side that's adequately addressed it. Those that